Skip this video and you'll miss the soul contract you signed before you arrived. Not a literal document, not a legal agreement negotiated in some prior existence with terms you could recite if only your memory allowed it, but a way of relating to your life, your challenges, and the specific, sometimes difficult shape of your circumstances that changes something important about how you meet them. And maybe that is exactly why you are here now, at this hour, staying instead of scrolling past. It is no coincidence that you are here. Let that sentence settle without needing proof, not as flattery, not as fate handed to you on a plate, just as a possibility worth sitting with for the next few minutes. Before this video ends, you will understand three things. Soon you will see why the framework of a soul contract, examined honestly, is less about literal metaphysical certainty and more about a specific, useful shift in how you relate to difficulty, one that neither denies real hardship nor allows it to become the only story available about your life. Later, you will understand why the hardest chapters of a life are so often the ones that eventually produce the deepest capacity, and what that pattern might actually suggest about purpose and difficulty being more connected than they initially appear. And before we close, I will guide you through a short practice that many people describe as the first time they felt genuine reconciliation with a difficult part of their story, rather than either denying it or being defined entirely by it. So before we go further, take this as your first remembering. If any part of this message is already landing somewhere true in you, subscribe to this channel now. Not as a reflex, but as a small, quiet commitment to keep relating to your own life as something with purpose woven through it, even in its difficulty. When you subscribe, you are telling your own mind, I am willing to consider that my life was not simply happening to me at random. I am willing to explore whether even my hardest chapters carry a thread of purpose I have not yet fully recognized. Because there are two kinds of people who arrive at a message like this one. There are those who hear the phrase soul contract and dismiss it immediately as fantasy offered to make suffering feel more palatable. And there are those who stay long enough to understand that this framework, held with appropriate honesty and care, can genuinely change someone's relationship with their own difficult history without requiring literal metaphysical certainty to be useful. You already know which one you are tonight. For most of your life, you were likely taught to think of difficult circumstances, an unstable childhood, a specific loss, a body or health condition that made things harder, a family pattern you did not choose, as simply bad luck, random misfortune with no thread of purpose running through it. This framework, while feeling realistic, offers very little beyond pure endurance, a difficulty to be survived and, at best, forgotten. There is another way of relating to the same difficult circumstances, not requiring you to believe you chose your suffering in some prior existence with full conscious understanding, but simply asking whether the specific shape of your particular difficulty has in fact produced specific capacities in you that a different, easier life would not have required. This is the first revelation. Whether or not a soul contract is literally, metaphysically true, examining your life through this lens tends to reveal genuine, observable patterns worth taking seriously. Here is a simple way to feel this directly. Think of a specific difficulty in your own life, one that felt, and perhaps still feels, deeply unfair, something you would not have chosen if given an easier alternative. Now ask yourself honestly, what capacity, what sensitivity, what specific understanding has that difficulty produced in you that you can identify clearly, something that would likely not exist in you, or would exist in a much less developed form, had that difficulty never occurred? For many people, examined honestly, a difficult early experience with instability produces, later, an unusual capacity to remain calm during other people's crises. A significant early loss produces, later, a depth of empathy for others experiencing loss that a person without that history often has to work much harder to develop. This is not a claim that the difficulty was worth the pain, or that pain should be sought out deliberately as some kind of growth strategy. It is simply an honest observation that difficulty and capacity are far more connected than a purely random misfortune framework tends to acknowledge. Many people spend years relating to their hardest chapters purely as wounds to be managed, kept separate from any sense of meaning or purpose, treated only as damage to be minimized, rather than also, simultaneously, as a source of genuine capacity that now exists specifically because of what was endured. And because purely managing a wound offers no larger meaning to hold alongside the pain, the difficulty tends to remain simply painful indefinitely, without ever becoming integrated into a fuller, more complete understanding of who someone has actually become as a result of living through it. This is the trap almost everyone circling unprocessed, difficult history lives inside without naming it. Relate to hardship purely as damage and miss the equally real, equally honest observation that the same hardship produced something genuinely valuable that now exists inside you. There are those who will spend a lifetime relating to their difficult history purely as wound, purely as damage, keeping it entirely separate from any sense of larger meaning or purpose. And there are those who will pause here, in this very video, and ask a quieter, more useful question. What if this specific difficulty, painful and real as it genuinely was, also produced a specific capacity in me worth honestly recognizing, without that recognition requiring me to pretend the difficulty did not hurt, not a promise, not a requirement to feel grateful for genuine suffering, but an invitation, available starting now. Memory aloud, Dan. Now listen carefully, because this is where the title becomes more than a title. The soul contract you signed before you arrived is not a claim demanding literal belief in a specific metaphysical event. It is a framework, useful whether taken literally or symbolically, for relating to your own life's specific shape, including its difficulties, as something carrying thread and purpose rather than only random, disconnected misfortune. You did not stumble into this life. You agreed to it. Let that sentence rest here for a moment, the way a single note rests before the next one arrives, not as a claim that you consciously chose your suffering with full understanding in some prior existence, a claim that can feel genuinely harmful when applied carelessly to serious trauma, but as a way of relating to your current life, exactly as it has actually unfolded, as something you are now living fully, participating in rather than merely enduring, whatever its origin may have actually been. Here is an important distinction worth naming honestly and carefully, because without it, this teaching can cause real harm rather than genuine comfort. This is not a message suggesting that abuse, severe trauma, or serious harm were chosen, deserved, or necessary for growth in any way that diminishes their genuine wrongness. Nothing about this framework should ever be used to suggest a person invited their own victimization, or that a perpetrator's harmful actions were somehow part of a beneficial cosmic plan requiring gratitude. That framing is not spiritual wisdom. It is a genuine distortion capable of causing real additional harm to people who have already suffered enough. The soul contract framework, used honestly and carefully, applies to the general shape and challenges of a life, not as retroactive justification for harm inflicted by others, which remains fully and simply wrong regardless of any capacity it may have inadvertently produced afterward. There are those who will hear the careful distinction just offered and feel some relief, recognizing that this framework was never meant to excuse genuine wrongdoing. And there are those who may still feel understandable caution about this entire subject, given how frequently spiritual language has been used carelessly to minimize real harm. That caution is valid and worth honoring. This message asks only this: for the general shape of your life, its challenges, its specific difficulties that were not the result of someone else's deliberate harm, is there value in relating to that shape as carrying purpose rather than only randomness? Take a slow breath right now, without needing to close your eyes if you are not ready. Notice the quality of the air entering your body. Bring gently to mind one difficult chapter of your life, choosing one that feels appropriate to examine through this lens, rather than one involving harm inflicted by another person. Notice, honestly, what capacity that chapter produced in you, however small, or however significant. You do not need to feel grateful for the difficulty itself. Just notice the capacity that now genuinely exists in you as a result. This is the beginning of the shift this video describes. Not denying pain, but recognizing capacity alongside it. If this message is beginning to touch something real in you, comment this phrase now. I am recognizing the purpose woven through my story. Writing it will not erase genuine pain from your history, but it becomes a small marker your own mind can return to later, a quiet anchor point in an ordinary day, a reminder that you once consciously chose to look for thread and purpose rather than only random misfortune. Now let the next layer open. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes specifically from holding your difficult history as pure damage with no accompanying meaning, a story that only subtracts from you rather than also, simultaneously, having contributed something real. This is the second revelation. Integration, genuinely holding both the real pain and the real capacity that emerged from it, tends to be far less exhausting over time than holding either extreme alone, either pure victimhood with no accompanying growth, or forced positivity that denies the pain ever happened in favor of only celebrating the growth. Notice how differently a difficult memory gets carried from these two different framings. A person holding only the wound tends to experience that memory as an open, unintegrated injury, resurfacing with the same raw intensity regardless of how much time has passed. A person who has genuinely integrated both the pain and the capacity that emerged from it tends to experience the same memory quite differently, still real, still capable of some sadness when recalled, but no longer purely wound, now also evidence of something genuinely valuable that exists because of, not despite, what was actually lived through. If this is resonating with you, subscribe now, not as a casual gesture, but as a small, energetic commitment to keep practicing this kind of integration instead of letting today's clarity dissolve quietly back into tomorrow's old, purely wounded relationship with your own history. Let it mean, I am choosing, on purpose, to hold both the pain and the purpose together. There is a particular myth worth naming directly, because without naming it, this teaching can be quietly misunderstood, especially given the important distinction already offered earlier. This is not a message suggesting every difficulty must eventually be understood or resolved into a tidy narrative of meaning, or that failing to find such meaning represents some kind of spiritual failure on your part. Some difficulties remain genuinely difficult without a clean, comfortable resolution, and forcing meaning onto genuine tragedy before you are honestly ready can itself become a form of bypassing rather than authentic integration. This framework is an invitation to explore, gently and at your own pace, not a requirement to produce meaning on demand for every painful chapter of your life. It is worth naming, too, that this kind of integration tends to unfold on its own timeline, often years after a difficulty first occurred, and rushing toward premature meaning-making can sometimes interfere with grief or processing that genuinely needs its own space first. A person who has just experienced a fresh loss, for instance, is rarely well served by immediately searching for the lesson or the silver lining, a search that can feel dismissive of the very real, present pain still being felt. This framework tends to be most useful in retrospect, applied to difficulties that have had genuine time and space to be fully grieved or processed first, rather than as an immediate response meant to shortcut necessary mourning. Consider, too, how this integration differs meaningfully from simple silver lining thinking, which tends to minimize difficulty in favor of an immediate, often premature positive reframe. Silver lining thinking says everything happens for a reason, quickly, almost reflexively, often to make the speaker, rather than the sufferer, more comfortable with witnessing pain. Genuine integration takes considerably longer, requires the difficulty to be fully felt and honored first, and arrives, when it arrives, not as a quick reframe offered by someone else, but as an honest recognition reached gradually, in your own time, from your own lived experience of what actually grew from what was actually endured. Here is something worth sitting with honestly. Many people secretly resist this kind of integration, even while wanting genuine peace with their own history, because holding both pain and purpose simultaneously can feel disloyal to the pain itself, as though acknowledging any resulting capacity somehow minimizes how much the difficulty genuinely hurt. This concern is understandable and deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Integration does not require you to be grateful for suffering or to suggest the difficulty was worth its cost. It simply allows both truths to exist together. The pain was real, and something genuinely valuable also now exists because of what was lived through. If this describes something in you, you are not failing at this shift. You are standing right at its edge, which is exactly where this practice is designed to meet you. Now we move toward the practice hidden inside this message. Let your body settle wherever you are sitting or lying right now. You do not need silence around you, only a small amount of willingness inside you. Soften your gaze, or let your eyes close if that feels right. Let your next breath arrive a little slower than the one before it, not forced, simply unhurried. Feel the weight of your body being held by whatever is beneath it, the chair, the floor, the surface that has been holding you this entire time without asking anything in return. You are not trying to force meaning onto genuine pain. You are simply opening space to notice what may already, honestly, be true alongside it. As you breathe, bring to mind, gently, the difficult chapter you identified earlier. Inhale and silently acknowledge the pain. This hurt, and it was real. Exhale and silently acknowledge the capacity that also, genuinely, exists now as a result. And this also grew in me. Inhale, honor the pain. Exhale, honor the capacity. Let this happen 2 or 3 more times, at your own unhurried pace, holding both truths together rather than choosing one over the other. There is no wrong way to practice this. There is only the noticing, and the gentle return to it whenever old either-or thinking reappears, which it will, and which is simply part of the practice, rather than a failure of it. As you continue breathing at this slower pace, silently repeat the sentence forming underneath this entire message. You did not stumble into this life. You agreed to it. Let the words move with your breath rather than your urgency. You did not stumble into this life. On the inhale, you agreed to it. On the exhale, feel how different this sentence lands when it is received not as a claim requiring literal proof, but as a quiet, honest way of participating fully in the life you are actually, currently living, exactly as it has unfolded. Notice, without needing to change anything further, whether something in your relationship with your own history feels even slightly different than it did when this video began. Perhaps a small integration, perhaps very little has shifted, and that is completely fine too. This practice is not measured by a single dramatic breakthrough. It is measured the way any genuine integration is actually built, through quiet, repeated practice, returning again and again to holding both truths together rather than only one. Now, gently bring your attention back to the room around you, to the sound of your own presence here, to the simple fact that you stayed through this entire message when a dozen easier distractions were only a swipe away. That choice to stay is itself a small act of the very integration this video has been describing. Let us gather what this message has offered you. The recognition that a soul contract, taken literally or symbolically, is a framework for relating to your life as carrying thread and purpose rather than only randomness. The careful, important distinction that this framework never applies as justification for harm inflicted by others, which remains simply wrong regardless of any capacity it may have inadvertently produced. The understanding that genuine integration, holding both real pain and real capacity together, tends to be far less exhausting than holding either extreme alone. The honesty that this integration unfolds on its own timeline and differs meaningfully from premature silver lining thinking that rushes past necessary grief. And the practice, simple enough to repeat whenever an old memory arises, of one breath, one honored pain, one honored capacity, one quiet sentence that can guide you back toward integration. You did not stumble into this life, you agreed to it. If this message reached you at the right moment, like this video now, not for an algorithm, but as a way of sealing this recognition in your own field of attention, subscribe if you have not yet, because the next transmission will go deeper into what happens once this integration becomes familiar, how relationships and purpose shift once old history is no longer purely wound, and why the people who eventually find the most peace with their past are rarely the ones who tried hardest to simply forget it. Share this with someone who has been carrying a difficult chapter purely as damage, someone who needs to hear that the same chapter may have also, quietly, given them something genuinely worth recognizing. You are not simply a victim of random misfortune. You are not required to be grateful for genuine pain in order to also recognize genuine capacity that grew from it. You are not disloyal to your own suffering by also honoring what it built in you. You did not stumble into this life. You agreed to it, and perhaps the sole contract you signed before you arrived was never a literal document waiting to be recalled in detail, but the quiet, ongoing agreement happening in you right now, the moment you choose to meet your own life, difficulty and capacity both, as something you are fully living rather than merely enduring.